There is a stigma around STIs. Even with perfect hygiene, people are still getting UTIs, especially Black women have been subjected. They've been used, they've been studied, they've been cut open and experimented on without consent. Period pain is normal, but period pain that interferes with your daily life is not. What if the reason you haven't gotten answers isn't because your body is broken, but because the system was never built to listen to you? Welcome to G Chats. Hi guys, welcome back to G Chats with your host, Gianna Jara, here in the G Spot. I'm actually super excited for this episode because it's an educational one, and it's actually one of my favorite educational topics, and it is endometriosis. I love talking about endometriosis because, as many of you know, endo doesn't get nearly as much attention as it deserves. And it's very frustrating as a women's health scientist, someone who's working in this space, and uncovering and learning more about the medical advancements and things like that. I just feel like people don't talk about endo a lot, and I do believe that there's so many people walking around with endometriosis and they don't even know because the diagnosis is like just so difficult. So I wanted to make today's episode all about endometriosis. I wanted to really start this off, and I did prepare notes. So again, it's going to be one of those episodes that I'm going to be looking down, reading from my notes, because when it comes to very educational topics, I want to make sure that you guys get the most out of the episode and you're really learning about your body, learning about these topics. I think it's just so important so that you feel informed after listening and not me just like sitting here and talking off the top of my head and forgetting some key things. So I kind of just have my notes down. And again, to start, I wanted to make sure that I highlight that endometriosis is one of the most misunderstood diseases that exist in medicine. And unfortunately, it's one that is one of the most normalized, unfortunately. And somewhere along the way, we have truly convinced generations of women that debilitating period pain or debilitating pelvic pain in general is just something that we have to live with. And we've been told to just take ibuprofen or Tylenol, use a heating pad, push through work and push through intimacy, keep going. There is pain when it comes to endometriosis that causes some people to vomit, pass out, miss school, miss work, avoid intimacy altogether, or spend days in bed. And that is not what a healthy menstrual cycle, for example, is supposed to look like at all. This isn't simply a bad period. And for most of my life, as someone who has grown up with bad periods, that is something that I've always noticed is people were like, you have bad periods? Maybe you have endo. Go to your doctor and check if you have endo. So endo is very much tied. Like, these are mutually exclusive in a lot of people's brain, where they hear bad period equals endo. That isn't always the case. This isn't simply a bad period. It might be a sign of an inflammatory disease that's called endometriosis that shouldn't just be reduced to a bad period. So I want to talk about in this episode what endometriosis actually is, why it has historically been so difficult to diagnose, and most importantly, some of the incredible medical advancements that are happening that are giving me a genuine hope for the future of diagnosis and treatment of endometriosis. So let's start with the basics, because I do think that there is still a ton of confusion that exists around endo. What is endometriosis? Well, endometriosis occurs when the tissue that closely resembles, key phrasing here that I highlighted in my notes, closely resembles the lining of the uterus that grows outside of the uterus. Now, the reason why this is super important to understand is because for years, people referred to endometriosis as the uterine tissue growing outside of the uterus. But we have now learned that it is far more complex than that. I am someone who grew up believing that endometriosis is the tissue inside of your uterus, your uterine lining, growing outside of the uterus. That's what I was told. That is what I grew up thinking endometriosis is. And that is what a lot of people still think endo is. It's important to understand that the endometriosis lesions behave similarly to the endometrium, which is the lining of the uterus, but they are biologically different. So they have their own inflammatory environment, they have their own nerve supply, and they respond to hormones in ways that contribute to chronic pain and inflammation. This, again, isn't endometrial tissue growing outside of the uterus. It's endometrial-like tissue. So similar, but different. And that matters because It's not just something where, oh, it affects the uterus. These lesions can grow on the ovaries, the fallopian tubes, the bladder, the bowel, the pelvic lining, and in rare cases, even outside of the pelvis, right? There are people who have been diagnosed with endometriosis, and these lesions have been found on the brain, the diaphragm, and other parts of the body. Every month, these lesions respond to hormonal changes. They create inflammation that can lead to scarring, adhesions, ovarian cysts that are called endometriomas, and sometimes organs literally become stuck together by scar tissue from endometriosis. That in itself highlights that this isn't just like endometrial lining that's growing outside of the uterus and now just growing on top of the uterus. It's exceeding that. It's far beyond that. It doesn't always stay localized to just the uterus. And one thing that I think is really important to clarify is that the amount of disease that someone has does not necessarily correlate with how much pain that they experience. So someone with a few lesions can have excruciating pain, while someone with widespread disease may experience relatively mild symptoms. That disconnect is one of the reasons that so many patients are dismissed, because imaging might appear normal for many people, or the disease might not look severe enough to explain the symptoms, but pain is far more complicated than what we can simply see with our eyes through imaging. And symptoms can include severe menstrual cramps. So for some people, it is related to their period. And a lot of times it could be because of the location. It could be because these lesions are in sync with some of the hormones. There can be chronic pelvic pain, pain during sex, pain with bowel movements or urination, painful ovulation, bloating. Sometimes that's called endobelly, that trends a lot on social media, fatigue, infertility, lower back pain, and gastrointestinal symptoms that often mimic what we call irritable bowel syndrome, also known as IBS. Now, because these symptoms overlap with so many other conditions, from autoimmune diseases to different gynecological concerns, urological issues, gastroenterologists might think that it is a GI issue. They overlap. It is because the symptoms overlap with so many other conditions. So many patients spend years bouncing between different specialists, as I mentioned, the gastroenterologist, the gynecologist, the urologist, primary care physicians, all these other physicians, and emergency rooms, not to be forgotten, before anyone ever mentions endometriosis, because again, it's sometimes these symptoms overlap and it's not obvious that it's endo, because endo can be a little confusing. And on average, it's still, unfortunately, and I think that a lot of people don't realize this, it takes many years to get a diagnosis of endo. The scariest and probably saddest part of this is because it can be so confusing, on average, it still takes years, and I'm not joking when I say years, to receive a diagnosis of endometriosis. The average is 7 to 10 years. So that means that that's nearly a decade of pain for someone until a physician or someone believes or has the thought that maybe we should investigate endometriosis. 7 to 10 years, nearly a decade of pain before someone's considering and investigating endometriosis. I think that that is huge. And historically, the gold standard for diagnosing endometriosis has been laparoscopic surgery. So in other words, one of the only ways historically that we've been able to definitively diagnose the disease was through surgery itself. Laparoscopic surgery is surgery. You have to go in, and what they're essentially doing is they're undergoing an invasive procedure. To be blunt about it, it is pretty invasive, to simply get validation that what they've been experiencing was real. So what happens is they go in and try to find lesions. And if they find those lesions, they could take a biopsy of said lesion and actually test in the lab and look at this lesion and see if it is that endometrial-like tissue and things like that. They can determine by going inside of your body and trying to find the endometrial lesion, depending on where you're having pain. A lot of times it's them going in the pelvis, because the pelvis region is largely where many women do have endometrial lesions. Again, that is just a sign that to get the validation of, yes, you have this disease, you have to go through an invasive procedure to validate that experience. Now, thankfully, this is where some really exciting advancements are beginning to happen so that it's less invasive to diagnose people. So researchers around the world are working through different techniques to identify biomarkers, which are measurable biological signals that are found in blood, saliva, menstrual fluid, or the uterine lining that may one day allow us to diagnose endometriosis without surgery. We aren't completely there yet, but the progress over the past several years has been absolutely remarkable. I have to say it. I know I talk a lot about how funding is being pulled left and right from women's health advancements, and that is true, but it's truly amazing what we've been able to accomplish despite the lack of funding. Scientists are studying inflammatory proteins, immune markers, microRNAs, genetic signatures, and even the microbiome to see whether these patterns could reliably identify the disease earlier. So that, I think, is just like super exciting to see. We might not have a world one day where we have to undergo surgery to diagnose someone of endometriosis. We could have potentially a blood test one day, a saliva test, a microbiome test that identifies endometriosis. Like, that would be incredible. And the reason why this is advancing is because we are acknowledging that inflammatory proteins have a role in endometriosis, right? When I say that we're doing saliva testing and blood testing, it's not that there's like one thing we're looking at. It could be a profile of your blood that's looking for inflammatory proteins. And if that shows up at a certain threshold, it might be able to identify endometriosis. So we are still setting up kind of those baselines and thresholds. Think of autoimmune diseases. And I talk a lot about this on my page on TikTok, where endometriosis, it walks this fine line of being an inflammatory and autoimmune disease. Historically, we know, like now, that certain autoimmune conditions have certain biomarkers that we test for in the blood and antibodies that we test for to determine if someone has lupus or rheumatoid arthritis and other things. We have certain antibodies that we look for to see if someone has these different autoimmune conditions. There is a world where potentially that could exist for endometriosis, where we have certain immune markers that we can set a threshold of and test someone's blood or saliva to see if they have endometriosis. I think that that is just incredible, and that could really change women's health for the better. Another exciting area of research that's advancing is the imaging itself. So traditional ultrasounds often miss superficial endometriosis, but highly specialized transvaginal ultrasounds that are performed by experienced clinicians along with advanced MRI protocols are becoming much better at detecting certain forms of the disease, particularly deep infiltrating endometriosis, which is huge. So while imaging still cannot rule endometriosis out completely, it is becoming a much more powerful tool than it used to be. We are also learning far more about what actually drives endometriosis. Based on what I said about the blood work and the saliva testing, and I was mentioning how we are able to potentially set thresholds and look for certain things in the blood, is because what we are learning about endo and what's driving the disease. So for decades, treatments always focused on almost exclusively about suppressing estrogen specifically, because endometriosis is considered an estrogen dependent disease. And while hormones absolutely, like 100% play an important role, researchers now understand that the disease is also deeply connected to inflammation, immune dysfunction, abnormal nerve growth, fibrosis, and angiogenesis, which is the formation of new blood vessels that help the lesions survive. They literally have their own blood supply. They make their own blood supply. Why does any of that matter? Well, because when you understand the biology of the lesions itself, you can create treatments that target the biology instead of simply shutting down someone's menstrual cycle. Obviously, what we knew about the disease at the time, that's why endometriosis has been reduced to just a period condition or just like a hormone condition, just a gynecological condition, because people hear estrogen, oh, estrogen's involved, so it's just an estrogen hormone issue. Let's suppress estrogen and all will be fine. And scientists are currently investigating medications that target inflammation, immune pathways, fibrosis, nerve signaling, and the blood vessels that feed the lesions. So rather than taking this one-size-fits-all approach, future therapies may eventually be tailored to the specific biological drivers of an individual's disease, which is absolutely huge. There's also exciting advancements happening in surgery itself. So what we know now is that excision surgery, where lesions are carefully cut out by highly trained specialists, this can't be done by just anyone, are generally providing better long-term outcomes than simply burning the lesions on the surface, which is an old technique that's called an ablation that is no longer recommended. Excision is the gold standard. It is what most physicians recommend. If you have endo, we try to get people to do excision surgery and ablation. I hope that a lot of people aren't doing it, but I know that some people do still do. It's a technique where they burn the lesions on the surface, and excision is technically much more challenging, but when performed by experienced surgeons, it can remove the disease more completely while preserving healthy tissue. And that's why it's the gold standard. Now, that doesn't mean that surgery is a cure because, of course, unfortunately, endometriosis can still reoccur. Those lesions can come back in other spots, but we're able to remove the lesion in one area while preserving healthy tissue that's around it. But we're continuing to improve both the surgical techniques and our understanding of which patients are more likely to benefit. I think what we see is that there's this combined approach here. Research is trying to advance in all of these spaces. So I'm hoping one day there's a world where we understand what's driving one patient's endometrial lesions, whether that's immune dysfunction, whether that is hormones, whether it's a combination of everything, inflammation and all of the things. And what we can do is when we understand that, we can take out the lesions that do exist with the gold standard of excision surgery, and more specialists can become trained at performing excision surgery so that we can take out these lesions, preserve healthy tissue, but then potentially have therapies and medications that exist that we can put these people on so that new lesions do not grow, because we are targeting what is driving lesions to grow and reoccur. That combined approach can get rid of old lesions and stop new ones from forming. So that is really exciting. And one area of research that's really fascinating me personally is the growing conversation around the immune system and the microbiome. If I had to reduce my expertise down to like one area, it would be the vaginal microbiome. I broadly understand and specialize in female reproductive health, but my niche and where I started was the vaginal microbiome. And what we're seeing, which is really exciting, is that we're beginning to understand that endometriosis, again, isn't just a disease of misplaced tissue, but it's an inflammatory disease that's involving immune cells, inflammatory cytokines, hormonal signaling, nerve pathways, and potentially even alterations in the gut and reproductive microbiomes. And researchers are still trying to understand exactly how these systems interact. I think that this systems biology approach is going to fundamentally change how we think about women's health over the next decade. That is because I've been saying on my platform pretty much, I want to say for the last 4 years, that women's health should not be looked at or treated in these silos that I feel like it has been historically. I talk a lot on my page about how if you're having a gut issue, you see a GI doctor. You're having a gynecological, like a vaginal issue, you go see the gynecologist. Urology is for the urinary issues, and always going through different specialists, when I do think that fundamentally the bladder is connected to the gut, which is connected to your hormones, which is connected to your vaginal microbiome, which is connected to your immune system. Like, they are all interconnected pathways and interconnected systems, but historically have been treated as separate and not seen as interconnected. And I do want to be careful because social media often gets ahead of the science. There is no current diet that cures endometriosis, for example, because I think people recognize, oh, it's an inflammatory thing, so you have to focus on the gut. So there are these connections that I think people are aware of, but social media can be quick to make blanket statements that maybe aren't necessarily validated by science just yet. That doesn't mean that they can't be validated by science later, but at this time, I think we just have to be careful not to get ahead of the science. There's no supplement that cures endometriosis. There is no detox that cleanses your pelvis and gets rid of endo. There's no cleanse that you can do, no tea that you can do, or a hormone balancing protocol that has been proven to eliminate the disease. Some people absolutely find that nutrition, again, physical therapy, exercise, stress management, or certain supplements do improve their quality of life or reduce their symptoms and helps the disease become more manageable. And that absolutely matters. Symptom management is incredibly valuable and it might help with disease progression as well. But symptom management is not the same thing as curing the disease. And I think that that's a really important distinction and separation that we have to make, because those are two different conversations. There are definitely things that you can do to help with symptom management and to help with disease progression. But I just think that you have to be careful if you're scrolling on the internet and something is promising to cure the disease. Raise an eyebrow. I do see a lot of videos that start off with scientists don't want you to know X, Y, and Z. Doctors don't want you to know this, but this tea is going to cure endometriosis. That's not true. At the core, a scientist and a doctor want to cure your endometriosis. They do. Like, I hate the narrative that like doctors just want to keep you sick. Scientists want to keep you sick. Like, no, these people want you to get better. I understand that there's a lot of shady things that happen within the medical system. I don't think that every single doctor is a great doctor. I think there's some doctors that aren't great doctors, some doctors that shouldn't be doctors. I can critique the system. I'm someone who actively critiques the system, being someone who is in the system. I can critique the system all I want, but also acknowledge that the enemy isn't the scientist and the enemy isn't always the doctors. In some cases it can be, but not in all cases. And I think that that matters to discuss, because there are other systems at play and other things involved that mess with the medical system that isn't the fault of the doctors. There's management that's involved with how the hospitals are run. There's insurance companies involved. There's pharmaceutical companies involved. There's so many different layers and involvements within the medical system that I think like blaming the scientists and the doctors are like the people that should be getting the least of the heat when it comes to advancing the space. That is like something that I just want people to keep in mind, because I do see a lot of this rhetoric. I actually just made a TikTok video not that long ago where there was a really large influencer who was like, this tea is going to cleanse. You guys probably saw it, but it was like, this tea is going to cleanse out your vagina after your period and make you smell better and taste better and make your vagina wetter and things like that. And I was breaking it down. I was like, guys, like, no, I see these type of videos often. And I do see people who are like, this tea is going to get rid of your endometriosis. Your physician doesn't want you to know this, but this tea is going to cure you from endo. Like, no, they're trying to sell you something. There are ways to help. I've talked about how probiotics can help with endometriosis. There's literature and there's science talking about how probiotics can help and how the microbiome is involved with endo. And I've shared that, and I've shared how my products, if you do decide to take our probiotics and you have endo, how it could potentially help. But I would never get on here and say it's going to cure it. I talk about how gut revival and with clarity can be taken together to support urinary tract infections. That doesn't mean that it's going to cure your UTIs, but I think it can help reduce the amount of recurrence, restore the microbiomes, and in turn, reduce the amount of times you get UTIs and reduce you getting UTIs in general. I always say, like, it's not a cure. You need to take your antibiotics if you're having a UTI, but it definitely can help in the future. Maybe certain supplements, certain teas, different herbal remedies and things like that can help with symptom management, and as research advances, potentially with excision surgery, help reduce like new lesions from coming in. That is very possible. I don't want to deny that. I just think that we need to be careful and not act like scientists, researchers, physicians aren't actively trying to find new therapies, new medications, and new ways to help people with endo. It's just funding is crap. And again, that's what I'm saying. Like, it's above the researchers. The government, in a few weeks, I'm going to be making a video that's talking about how politics affect us women, not just about the doctors, the researchers, the scientists. Like, we want to study this and research this more, but there's so many other things at play, the policies, the administration, the funding, so many things. So if you're listening to this because you've spent literally years wondering whether your pain is normal, I want you to hear what I'm about to say very clearly. Severe pain deserves investigation. I don't care what anyone says, it deserves investigation. You do not have to earn the right to be taken seriously. You do not have to wait until you're trying to get pregnant and struggling to get pregnant before someone investigates your chronic pelvic pain. Your quality of life matters right now. If you're not trying to get pregnant and you are just feeling like something is wrong, you are having intense, severe pain, you deserve to be taken seriously. The thing that gives me the most hope when it comes to endometriosis and women's health in general isn't one single breakthrough. It's that for the first time in a very long time, researchers are looking at endometriosis at every single angle, from every single lens: genetics, immunology, neuroscience, imaging, surgery, biomarkers, the microbiome, and personalized medicine. Tells me that we've finally stopped asking whether women's pain is real and started asking the much more important question of how do we understand it well enough to treat it better. That is the type of advancement I want to see in women's health. And I genuinely believe that that shift is going to change the lives of millions of people living with endometriosis everywhere. I think a lot about the women who are struggling with endometriosis in areas that aren't the developed world. And that really does break my heart. And that is why I care so much about being so critical of the system here in the States, living in the United States, because whether we like it or not, unfortunately or fortunately, however you want to see this, the United States is viewed as a global leader. And that does also exist within medicine and innovation. And so I feel like that is why we have to be critical, because we are setting a standard for a lot of the world, the developed world, the non-developed areas. We set a standard that can improve the quality of life for people everywhere. So when researchers are demanding more funding, more research, more access to grants and things like that, it is because a lot of us recognize that this doesn't just help the people here in this country, this helps people everywhere, millions of people living with endo. I do think that the research is promising, and I do think we're shifting away from just naming endometriosis as a female reproductive health issue, an estrogen issue, we're in a hormone issue. We're moving away from that, and we're now starting to look at endometriosis as a full body disease, a immune disease, a inflammatory disease, and that matters when we're trying to give people better care. I hope that this video made those of you who are curious about endometriosis or living with endometriosis feel seen, heard, and cared for. And I hope that this video gives you guys a lot of hope, because I am having a lot of hope as a researcher. And I hope you guys knowing that I have more hope is something that gives you hope. Like, I'm not just saying this. There are a lot of times where I look at the state of the world, I look at where we're at in society and the bigotry that exists around us and the way funding is getting cut and policies and things like that. I look at that often and I'm reflecting. I'm like, damn, like what a shitty time to be adulting. Like, this sucks. And then when I prepare for episodes like this, and that's why I do like to have like happier episodes where we're talking about breakthroughs, because when I have episodes like this, I get to take a moment to say, research is advancing. I'm in a space that makes me happy. I'm in a space that I enjoy. I'm in a space surrounded by other professionals who do want to see women's health advance. And that makes me happy. So episodes like these make me happy. I hope episodes like these make you guys happy. Let me know what other topics you want me to cover in the next few episodes. I do have my content calendar pretty much planned out for the next month or two. So I have some exciting episodes coming up, and I really hope that you guys enjoyed this. Don't forget to leave a comment, thumbs it up, and don't forget, if you're listening on Spotify, to rate the podcast, because that helps a lot. But nonetheless, I love you guys so much, and I will see you guys in next week's episode. Bye, guys.